This talk is on some extra specialty equipment that we don't really have access to in our classes. I just want you to be aware because, right, different photos just require different equipment. We can't get everything done just naturally. There's a saying out there that, a good photographer can make a photo with any camera. And that's true, but there's occasional types of photographs that we can only make with specialty equipment. And so I'm going to go over just some interesting equipment that you may or may not be aware of, just as a little extra for this class. So the thing is, right now, the state of photography is kind of changing in that we are really starting to get into an age of mirrorless cameras. And so here we no longer have an eyepiece and a mirror. You wouldn't be looking through the back. In these cameras, we have just an LCD screen that we kind of monitor taking our photo as if we were looking through the eyepiece. And this is nice because the mirror can cause camera shake, so this is good for certain purposes where mirror shake would be detrimental to photos. And previously, these systems were problematic because of the focus systems. But now we're in a new age, an age of computer-assisted vision or computer vision that's really changing the game. And so mirrorless cameras are becoming more and more common. It's nice. They're smaller and lighter. A lot of benefits to them, and they're also better for video. I can't remember what the reason for that is, but there is a reason for it, and I'm sure you could Google that if you really wanted to know. We're still using, obviously, DSLRs that have mirrors that are, routing the image to our eyepiece. But more and more, these mirrorless cameras are becoming just as good as the DSLRs, and a lot of people are moving in that direction. Besides just 35 millimeter type format cameras like the ones we've been using, DSLRs, there's medium format cameras. And medium format cameras are just a larger film size or sensor. And so think about it, the way focal lengths work, you remember that crop sensor thing. So now we have a different effect on our lenses. So unlike, our Canon cameras, a 50 millimeter lens on our Canon camera is like the equivalent of a regular 35 millimeter, like 75 millimeters or 80 millimeters. Now a 50 millimeter on a medium format is going to be more like a 35 millimeter, really, right? Or somewhere, I don't, it kind of depends on the size of this. And there's various cameras. I used to have a Miyama 6-7, and they're really neat cameras to play with. Fun. This is a Hasselblad. If you've never heard of a Hasselblad, it's kind of a really famous medium format camera. But that's all I really have to say to that. But we can get even bigger, and we can have things like large format view cameras. And when I was in photography school, they also made us have a large format view camera for doing a lot of our work. And so these take film that is about 4 inches by 5 inches, or if you have a digital camera back for these, right? Super expensive, obviously, but these are really great for architectural photography because of the tilt shift system. So when you think about it, when you're down on the ground, you're looking up, you'll notice these perspective problems, right? By tilting and raising and shifting the plane that the back or the front is on, right? We can get those lines to go straight up and down, right? We can change the way the plane hits this the sensor. Of course, we can also just go into Photoshop and use the transform tool. So it's not like super necessary, but this is a very interesting type of camera. Other type of cameras, Lomo type cameras. So these are like really junky cameras, and the most famous being the Holga. And they are famous because they're just these really cheap plastic cameras with cheap plastic lenses, and you actually use film with them. And each one is slightly different. That's kind of the fun of it too, that they have different light leaks coming into each camera you buy. And so you get weird effects on the film from these weird light leaks. And there's a lot of Instagram filters that are based off like Lomo and Holga cameras. And even if you think that, well, no serious photographer then could use these, there are indeed even photojournalists using this. David Burnett exclusively uses the Holga in his work. And so I'll put this link on our website for you to look through some of his work here, and you can see the type of photographs. So he uses black and white film and just gets really delightful photos out of these, using them for photojournalism. Of course, again, it is that any camera will get you some photos. You just have to be aware of its limitations and know how to use then its limitations to the best, right? So, your smartphone, sometimes the best camera is the camera you have. You have a Spot News extra credit assignment, which I don't know if there's even any possibility of doing that. But, right, if you were out and something happens, you got your phone in your pocket more than likely, right? Other things exist like GoPros, and that's if you need something underwater and stuff. So any camera is great to use. Other things you can do is some interesting effects with an IR converted DSLR, so infrared. So these shoot in the infrared spectrum rather than the visible spectrum. And to do this, they actually, your camera has an infrared filter on it. And usually there's just people who will do this for you obviously for money. Well, they'll remove that filter for you. And so then the effects of how it takes photos is completely different based on color of light. Moving on to lenses, obviously we've talked about wide and medium and telephoto, but really we haven't had any access in this class to super telephoto, although I believe we have 300 or 400 millimeters. I think super telephoto usually starts at about 400 millimeters, right? And so obviously these are the photos that are great for sports and wildlife, and these are very expensive to get a very good one. I mean, you're talking like the cost of a car for a lens. So obviously that's why I don't own one, but it sure would be nice to have. Of course, then there's fisheye lenses. So we're talking about extremely wide lenses that generally then have some kind of a barrel distortion to them. So there's circular ones where you actually get kind of a 360-ish view, but you see that actually you don't actually record anything. You don't get a 360 view, you get whatever view it is. But this one is just more of a full frame, right? So you actually fill the picture with images, and you get like 180 degrees or something. Maybe this is 360. I don't know how these work. I don't even. They're fun. The funny thing about fisheye lenses is it's like they're fun to shoot with like once or twice, and then you're like over it. And then, because if you did everything in fisheye, it would just get super boring, right? It's kind of like just a gimmick. We talked about the tilt shift cameras, right, where we saw how that works. Well, you can actually get tilt shift lenses for DSLR cameras, so you can actually get those effects of straightening out the perspective lines just on your camera. They're also kind of expensive. Macro lenses, so if we want to shoot objects at 1:1 or better, so 1:1 would mean the size that we're photographing it is the actual size it appears on our film sensor, right? Those would be macro lenses, so we can get even better than 1:1. Macro photography is really hard. And when you think about that, that's because what we know about aperture, the closer you are to a subject, the shallower your depth of field is. And it can be very hard. There's a lot of people doing macro photography are doing what's called stacked photos. So they will actually put the camera on what's called a rail, which is just this. It's just what it sounds like. It kind of slides the camera moving, forward or backward. And what they'll do is, now obviously you need something that's not moving to do this, and you just take like a bunch of photos moving your rail forward like 1/4 of a centimeter or 1/2 a centimeter, and you'll wind up with all these photos, and you can actually run it into software to align and then pull out the areas in focus. So it can be time consuming to do this. A cheap way of doing macro without a macro lens is you can actually reverse one lens on another lens, and I have a setup like this, and it's fun to play with. You can buy like a ring, and I got mine on eBay, and you just take another lens, take a nice sharp prime lens is your best bet, and actually just attach it reversed to your lens, and this becomes like this high magnification macro lens on the cheap. Another way you can do macro photography without a specific macro lens is to use extension tubes. So these are just what it sounds like. They're tubes that are just empty, right? There's no glass in these, and that's moving it farther away. Think about how focal length works. And so this changes the focus point, and so that allows us to do macro photography. Some other cool things are digiscoping or astrophotography or microscopy. So this is just simply putting a camera on some other lens, right? I've done this with bird photography. I have a spotting scope, and I've put not a DSLR, but just a point and shoot camera on the end of it with an attachment, and it's like shooting with like a 3,000 millimeter lens or something ridiculous like that. Hard as anything to get focus and everything. It's not the easiest in the world, but it's fun to play with. You also have to worry about a lot of shake, and that's why you see this like little shutter thing here. You can attach. I do have a microscope attachment that I use occasionally for photographing like tiny snails and things that I do in my spare time. And you can also attach it to a microscope. I'm sorry, not a microscope, a telescope, right? To do some astrophotography. And then, of course, lens filters. So the filters are what we put on the ends of the lenses, and you actually have a filter on your lens that you borrowed right now. You have what's called a UV filter. So a UV filter is a good just general filter that people use just for protection, because when you think about it, if you were to drop your lens, if you have a filter on it and something cracks that filter, that's way cheaper cracking a $10, $15 filter than cracking your lens, right? Where you have to throw away your lens and get a new lens. And so UV haze filters have become kind of standard for putting on as just protection, but it also has the benefits of that. Will help to cut down haze and stuff from the atmosphere. And obviously, besides also protecting your lens from cracks and things, it protects from dirt and dust, right? So you get your filter really dirty, no big deal, clean it, you're fine. Other types of lens filters that you might see is things like a polarizing filter. So this polarizes light to eliminate glare or not really super reflections, but some reflections. It's great for using for water, sky. So you'll notice that the sky gets noticeably darker with these. And how these usually work, they're usually called circular polarizing filters. And so they actually spin. They actually have like an up and a down or something, depending on, I guess, the angle of the sun and the light and stuff. I don't exactly know how they work, but you put it on, you screw it on your camera, and then it still is able to spin around. And so you would spin the polarizing filter until it's at the right angle to knock down the reflections or whatever you want. It darkens skies and improves the color saturation. Neutral density ones are good if you need to knock down light for some reason. Sometimes you want to, there's so much light, but you want to do a really slow maybe waterfall photo or something, right? So neutral density would actually be like removing some of the stops of light. Really, it's just basically like turning your ISO down. So that's what you can use that for. Graduated neutral densities are ones that actually they are maybe a stop or so darker up top and then completely clear towards the bottom, kind of maybe split in the middle, right? So these are good because generally speaking, right, the sky is going to be brighter than the landscape, especially like you see here in this one, the background's already in a darkness area, but the sky is still nice and bright. You want to even up that exposure. You could use a graduated neutral density. And then there's just all kinds of special effects filters like starbursts and nonsense like that, right? Dreamy, bokeh, whatever, I don't know. They're fine. One thing I forgot to put something in for was turning a lens more telephoto. Okay, so one thing I wanted to talk about with telephoto is you can make a lens even more telephoto by using something called a teleconverter. And so these are things that go in between your camera body and the lens. So the lens attaches on top here. This attaches to your camera like a normal lens. And what it does is it multiplies that that lens. So you see, usually you only find 1.4 or 2 times teleconverters. There is a trade-off here in that you are effectively taking your aperture down on a 1.4 one stop and on a 2 times 2 stops. So you have less light. So that can be a problem. I was blanking on the name before, but I stopped the video and put that slide in. So for lights, things that you might use are wireless transmitters and receivers, right? So we can actually trigger flashes that aren't on our cameras, like obviously sports and like an NBA arena. The photographers are connected into some wireless transmitting system, and with these lights on up in the catwalk that are going off. A lot of the flash units that they sell for SLRs have these built in that you can command other lights of the same type from the same company via these transmitters receivers, right? And not have to buy standalone transmitters receivers. Another light is something we've talked about, I believe, in portrait photography, and that's a ring flash, right? So this is a flash that instead of being, the thing up here, it goes right around the lens and creates our ring flash type thing. A dead giveaway is always this type of shadow, right? That's all the way around a person. But that does take away a lot of wrinkles and things. And that is all of the specialty equipment that I am going to tell you about. I'm sure there's way more, but yeah, that's interesting, right? Totally.